Hello everyone. When we speak of spiritual identity being tested, we are not talking about a simple moment of discomfort or a minor disagreement. We are speaking about a deep, soul-level confrontation with how the world sees you versus how God defines you. And there is always a vast difference between the two. Many times, the world forms an opinion before it understands your mission. It criticizes before it listens. It labels before it learns. And when this happens to a church, especially a church that seeks to follow God with sincerity, it can feel like an attack not just on beliefs, but on the very heart of the community. Yet this is precisely the moment when spiritual identity must rise to the surface. Identity is not proven in comfort. Identity is revealed in pressure. When the world misunderstands you, your immediate reaction is often to defend yourself, to argue your worth, to fight for recognition. But spiritual identity does not thrive through reaction. It grows through revelation. When the Seventh-day Adventist Church faced misunderstanding and disrespect, the true test was not the criticism itself, but the response. Because the response reveals who you truly are. And in that crucial moment, something extraordinary happened. Instead of collapsing under the weight of negative perception, the community looked upward, not outward. They remembered that their value comes not from the applause of the world, but from the calling of God. This is where true strength emerges. When you know who you are in God, you do not tremble when others question you. You do not bend when others push you. You do not lose direction when others misjudge your intention. You stand firm not with arrogance, but with quiet, resolute confidence that your purpose is rooted in something greater than public opinion. This kind of strength is not loud. It is not boastful. It is not combative. It is steady, consistent, anchored in the truth that God sees what others overlook and honors what others disregard. And so, when the church faced disrespect, something remarkable unfolded. Instead of allowing wounded pride to dictate their actions, they allowed spiritual maturity to guide them. They understood that disrespect is temporary, but identity is eternal. They recognized that criticism is fleeting, but character lasts. And they knew that the world might distort their image, but they could still project God's light. In that moment, they chose to live out their identity, rather than defend it. They chose to embody grace rather than demand recognition. They chose to reflect Christ, rather than resist conflict. This does not mean the pain of misunderstanding disappears. It simply means the pain does not become the compass. It means that rejection does not rewrite your purpose. It means that disappointment does not drain your devotion. When people misunderstand your mission, it is often because they have never witnessed such a mission before. And sometimes, the world is not shocked because you responded with power, but because you responded with peace. The greatest surprise is not strength that roars, it is strength that remains calm. In 2026, the profound response of the church reminded the world that identity is not proven by retaliation. It is proven by resilience. It is seen when a community continues doing good even when good is not returned to them. When they remain faithful even when their faith is questioned. When they remain hopeful even when hope seems misunderstood. This is the shock that shakes the world, the realization that spiritual identity, once rooted deeply, cannot be uprooted by criticism, cannot be diminished by disrespect, and cannot be manipulated by pressure. It stands firm, steady, shining, unshaken. And in the end, that is the identity that transforms nations. Steady, humble, unwavering. Respect is something many people desire, yet few truly understand. It cannot be demanded like a payment owed, nor can it be forced upon others through strength or argument. Respect grows naturally only in the presence of character. And this is where many communities stumble, because when they experience disrespect, the instinct is to retaliate, to raise the voice, to prove a point. But the moment you fight to be respected, you lose the spirit that earns respect in the first place. The strength of a spiritual community is not measured by how loudly it reacts, but by how consistently it reflects the character of the one who called it. When the church faces ridicule or misunderstanding, it stands at a crossroads. One path is the path of ego, answering insult with insult, criticism with anger, misjudgment with defensiveness. But the other path is higher, harder, and holier. It is the path of character. It is the quiet confidence that says, we do not need to prove who we are. We simply need to live who we are. And when a community chooses that path, its influence becomes unshakable. People may disagree with what you believe, but they cannot deny how you behave. They may reject your message, but they cannot ignore your example. Respect flows where character leads. So when the Seventh-day Adventist Church experienced disrespect, their greatest response was not a statement, a debate, or a campaign. It was the posture of their hearts. They showed the world that respect begins with self-respect rooted in spiritual identity. They refused to let disrespect provoke them into acting beneath their calling. Instead, they allowed their calling to elevate their response. And this became a powerful testimony that dignity is not lost because others fail to see it. Dignity is lost only when you abandon it yourself. Character is tested most deeply when you are treated unfairly. It is easy to be kind when others are kind. It is easy to be patient when others are gentle. It is easy to be gracious when others honor you. But when people misjudge you, misrepresent you, or misunderstand your motives, that is when the fruit of your spirit truly reveals itself. That is when the world leans in to see what you will do. That is when heaven watches to see what you will choose. And the right choice is never the choice that flatters the ego. It is the choice that glorifies God. When a community handles disrespect with wisdom instead of wounded pride, it confounds expectations. People anticipate retaliation. They expect confrontation. They assume you will mirror the negativity directed toward you. But when you respond with calmness, humility, and unwavering goodness, it disrupts the pattern of the world. It creates a moment where even those who criticize must pause and reconsider. Respect may not come immediately, but seeds of admiration begin to grow silently in hearts. The surprising truth is that the most powerful response to disrespect is not force, but faithfulness. It is not anger, but integrity. It is not fighting for your image, but preserving your spirit. And when the church chose this response, it set an example not only for believers, but for any community longing to influence the world without losing itself. Respect cannot be demanded, but it can be demonstrated so compellingly that even those who resist it eventually cannot deny it. In 2026, the world was not shocked because the church defended itself. The world was shocked because the church disciplined itself. It showed that respect is not a reaction you wait for from others. It is a posture you maintain regardless of others. And a posture of integrity always speaks louder than the voices that try to diminish it. This is the strength that turns disrespect into testimony. When the world expected conflict, something else emerged, something no one anticipated. It wasn't noise, it wasn't protest, and it wasn't an attempt to reclaim dignity through force. Instead, a deep, sincere movement of compassion rose up like a quiet dawn. In 2026, while many were preparing themselves to witness division, the church stepped into a completely different rhythm. They chose service over reaction, healing over hostility, and compassion over confrontation. And that choice became the moment that stunned the world. Not because it was loud, but because it was profoundly different. You see, the world understands power when it is displayed through dominance, influence, pressure, or control. But the world struggles to comprehend power expressed through humility. The world knows how to react to outrage, but it does not know how to respond to kindness that flows even in moments of disrespect. So when the church, instead of defending itself, poured its energy into global service, feeding the hungry, educating communities, strengthening families, supporting the broken, people had to pause. They had to rethink their assumptions. They had to wonder what kind of community does more good when wounded than it does when celebrated. This is the mystery of spiritual strength. It becomes most visible when the world expects weakness. And in 2026, the church took the very disrespect aimed at them and turned it into fuel for deeper compassion. They understood something important, that disrespect only has the power to damage you if you internalize it, but if you transform it into purpose, it becomes a platform. And that is exactly what happened. Instead of shrinking back or becoming hardened, they expanded their outreach, widened their arms, and softened their hearts even more. Communities around the world began to feel the ripple effect. Neighborhoods saw volunteers offering help with no expectation of recognition. Hospitals received support from people who simply wanted to serve. Families in crisis found comfort from those who had every earthly reason to be discouraged but chose hope instead. The message became clear. The church wasn't trying to shock the world by its words. It was shocking the world through its works. This kind of compassion does not appear automatically. It springs from a well that has been nurtured through prayer, humility, and a sincere desire to reflect God's heart. When you allow compassion to govern your response, you turn opposition into opportunity. And when a whole community chooses that path at the same time, the impact is multiplied beyond calculation. That is what happened. A movement not orchestrated by strategy, but awakened by conviction. A movement not driven by public relations, but by genuine love. And because the response was so unexpected, the world had to look again. They had to observe more carefully. They had to acknowledge that something unusual was happening. Disrespect normally breeds bitterness, but here it birthed generosity. Misunderstanding normally leads to resentment, but here it led to reconciliation. This reversal is what made the response so powerful. When a community chooses compassion right when the world gives them a reason not to, their actions gain a credibility that no speech could ever equal. In 2026, the shock did not come from a dramatic announcement. It came from a quiet revolution of kindness. A revolution that reminded the world that true greatness is not revealed in how loudly you fight, but in how deeply you love. And that is the kind of shock that awakens hearts, shifts perspectives, and leaves an imprint no opposition can erase. This is the moment compassion became the loudest voice. When a community chooses revival instead of retaliation, something sacred begins to stir beneath the surface. It does not start with noise, nor does it begin with external displays of strength. Revival begins quietly, like a seed buried in the soil, awakened by rain. And this is exactly what unfolded when the church decided that the world's disrespect would not dictate their identity or their response. Instead of rising in anger, they fell to their knees. Instead of seeking validation, they sought God's presence. And in that seeking, revival began to breathe again. True spiritual revival is not a public event, it is an inward awakening. It starts in the place where pride meets surrender. And when a church enters that sacred space, it becomes unstoppable not because of human talent, but because of divine alignment. In 2026, as pressure mounted around them, the church did not crumble, nor did it harden. It simply returned to its source. Prayer became their anchor, humility became their posture, and service became their expression. And in that environment, a deep renewal began to rise. When people gather in prayer with hearts tuned not to their own emotions but to God's voice, their perspective changes. The irritation that once seemed overwhelming dissolves. The fear that once clouded their vision clears. The desire to defend themselves fades, replaced by the desire to reflect God's heart more sincerely. And as this happened, something contagious began to spread. Not anger, not frustration, but spiritual hunger. Communities started forming prayer circles. Families rekindled evening devotions. Youth groups rediscovered purpose beyond entertainment. Leaders humbled themselves and began seeking guidance, not from trends or culture, but from Scripture and the whisper of the Spirit. Revival is not about dramatic signs. It is about hearts softened, minds renewed, and lives redirected toward what truly matters. But revival never ends with prayer alone. Prayer ignites service. Once the heart is aligned with God, the hands begin to move. And so, the church moved. They stepped outside their walls and into the real needs of their communities. They began visiting those forgotten by society, supporting those overwhelmed by life, uplifting those who had lost hope. Outreach was no longer merely a ministry, it became their language. And because it flowed from genuine revival, it carried power. This transformation did not go unnoticed. Even those who disagreed with the church's doctrines began to acknowledge the sincerity of its service. People may debate theology, but they cannot deny transformed lives. Revival in the heart leads to compassion in the streets, and compassion in the streets leads to credibility in the eyes of the world. And so, without trying to prove anything, the church began to shine brighter than it ever could through argument or defense. The unexpected beauty of what happened in 2026 is this. The pressure that was meant to break them became the fire that refined them. What was meant to silence them became the spark that awakened them. And what could have turned them inward in self-protection instead pushed them outward in love. Revival through humility and outreach is not a strategy, it is a spiritual reality. When a community returns to God with sincerity, God returns to that community with renewal. This is the kind of revival that cannot be manufactured. It cannot be planned or programmed. It only emerges when a people choose surrender over pride, prayer over reaction, and compassion over retaliation. And when they do, the world cannot help but take notice. This is how revival becomes the testimony. When the world grows darker, people look for anything that shines. They search for voices that are steady when everything else is shaking. And this is where the calling of God's people becomes unmistakably clear. You are not placed in the world to mirror its fears. You are placed in the world to reveal its hope. This is what it means to live prophetically. It does not mean predicting dates or announcing dramatic events. It means embodying truth so consistently that even in confusion, your life points in the right direction. In 2026, when tension and misunderstanding surrounded the church, they had a choice: blend into the noise or become the light. And they chose the light. Living prophetically is not about speaking loudly, it is about living differently. The world expects frustration when there is disrespect, anger when there is criticism, bitterness when there is injustice. But prophetic living breaks that expectation. It responds in ways that do not make sense to the natural mind, but reveal the supernatural heart of God. When the church was confronted with misunderstanding, instead of becoming reactive, it became reflective. Instead of becoming defensive, it became prayerful. Instead of becoming discouraged, it became determined to shine with even more compassion, more humility, more integrity. And this is what shocked the world. Not a prediction, but a posture. Not a declaration, but a demonstration. The prophetic life is not a life of grand pronouncements. It is a life of consistent obedience. It is seen when people choose forgiveness, even when offense feels justified. It is heard in the tone of a community that refuses to let hostility shape its voice. It is felt when faith continues to rise, even when circumstances try to suppress it. Prophetic living is not dramatic, it is faithful. A prophetic community does not wait for the world to get better before shining. It shines because the world is broken. It shines because people are searching. It shines because that is what it was created to do. And in that shining, hearts are softened, minds are opened, lives are touched. This is why the church's unexpected response carried such weight. It was a rare reminder that goodness still has power, that kindness still has authority, that truth still stands even when challenged. People began to notice that while others were reacting, the church was praying. While others were escalating tension, the church was building peace. While others were losing their way in the fog of confusion, the church was walking steadily in the clarity of God's calling. This consistency created credibility. And credibility opened doors. Doors to conversations, doors to reconciliation, doors to influence that cannot be purchased or forced. Influence that comes not from trying to be impressive, but from choosing to be faithful. The world has always been moved not by those who shout the loudest, but by those who shine the brightest. And shining has nothing to do with popularity, it has everything to do with presence. When a community carries the presence of God in its spirit, in its decisions, in its response to adversity, it becomes prophetic without announcing it. It becomes a beacon without advertising it. It becomes a testimony without defending it. In 2026, this kind of prophetic living drew attention because it was so different from the atmosphere of the time. Everyone was prepared for confrontation, but what they witnessed was conviction wrapped in humility. They expected resistance, but they encountered resilience. They anticipated anger, but they saw unwavering peace. And in that contrast, the world glimpsed something it had forgotten, a light that does not flicker when the wind blows, a hope that does not vanish when pressure increases, a truth that does not bend when misunderstood. This is how prophetic living becomes the light that cannot be ignored. When a community discovers that unity, healing, and education are among its greatest strengths, it begins to operate with a different spirit, one that lifts rather than divides, one that restores rather than reacts. And this is what happened when the church stepped into 2026 with a posture unexpected by the world. Many anticipated discord, internal fracture, or defensive movements. Instead, what emerged was a deeper sense of togetherness, a renewed commitment to teaching truth with compassion, and a quiet but powerful dedication to healing the wounds around them. Unity became not merely a value, but a visible reality. Unity is not the absence of differences, it is the decision to value purpose more than preference. It is the understanding that disagreements do not destroy a community unless the community forgets why it exists. And so, in a time when global culture was growing more fractured, the church chose harmony over hostility. Members who once stood apart found themselves drawn together not out of fear, but out of calling. They recognized that when they stood united in mission, no amount of disrespect from the outside could weaken them from within. And the world took notice. Because unity in a climate of division is always surprising. But unity alone is not enough. Unity must be expressed. And one of the most powerful expressions of unity is healing relationships, healing families, healing communities, healing the broken hearts that fill the world. Healing is a ministry that requires humility, patience, and compassion. It demands that you listen more than you speak, serve more than you are served, and love without calculating the cost. The church stepped into this role not reluctantly, but willingly. Where there was hopelessness, they brought encouragement. Where there was conflict, they brought reconciliation. Where there was suffering, they brought comfort. This kind of healing does not shout, it whispers. Yet its impact reaches far deeper than any argument ever could. Education, too, became a vital part of the church's witness, not education that merely informs, but education that transforms. Knowledge that opens minds, shapes character, builds resilience, and reveals truth. For years, many underestimated the power of teaching rooted in compassion and clarity. But in 2026, when the church faced misunderstanding, they did something profound. They educated instead of retaliated. They explained instead of argued. They taught instead of threatened. And slowly, perspectives began to shift. People who once dismissed the church started listening again. Minds once closed began to open. Hearts clouded by assumptions began to see more clearly. When education flows from humility and love, it becomes a healing force of its own. The world was not prepared for this combination. They expected a community fractured by criticism, weakened by disrespect, or distracted by conflict. But what they encountered was the opposite. A people more united than before, more committed to restoration, more dedicated to building, understanding, and lifting others. This unexpected strength became a revelation. It showed that unity does not make you fragile, it makes you formidable. It showed that healing is not weakness, it is spiritual authority. It showed that education is not merely information, it is transformation. And as the church continued to embody these qualities, something shifted in the atmosphere. Suspicion softened, hostility eased. Respect began to grow not because it was demanded, but because it was earned. A united community with a heart to heal and the wisdom to teach becomes a lighthouse in any storm, a steady presence in uncertain times, a reminder to the world that goodness still carries power. This is how unity, healing, and education became the witness that could not be silenced.